Welcome to the Clean Tech Pod, your go-to source for insights on Africa's journey towards a sustainable future. We are diving deep into the world of clean technology, exploring innovative solutions, and discussing the policies that are shaping our continent's energy landscape. Whether you're an industry expert, a policymaker, or someone passionate about a greener Africa, join us as we unpack the complexities of clean energy and sustainable development.
Welcome, Ms. Tengi George-Ikoli. Thank you for joining us today. I'm the Assistant Manager of the Energy Access Department of Clean Technology Hub. I'm Juliette. I handle the two portfolios, natural gas as a transition fuel and just energy transition. So Ms. Tengi here, she's the Senior Officer from Natural Resource Governance Institute. She's based in Abuja, and she works on oil dependency in Nigeria portfolio for NRGI. Prior to joining NRGI, she worked as the Program Coordinator for Nigeria Natural Resource Charter and NRC, implementing the charter, a set of economic global best practice principles to advance the interests of the Nigerian economy and its citizens in the management of the country's natural resource endowments. In her role, she collaborated with stakeholders to strengthen revenue management, ensure local community benefits, promote oil and gas industry efficiency, and enhance transparency and accountability in the extractive industry. In addition, Ms. Tengi represents the Global Reach seat in Publish What You Pay's Global Council. She holds a Joint Honours LLB in Law and Economics from the University of Wales, Swansea, and an LLM from the University of Bristol. Ms. Tengi, thank you for joining us. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So a little bit about my program. As we said, I serve as a senior officer for Natural Resource Governance Institute, which is a global institution. It's a public policy institute that focuses on good governance practices, both in natural resource governance and the energy transition. Our focus in Nigeria is to imagine a future beyond oil and to help stakeholders, government, civil society, private actors to rethink the role of oil in Nigeria's economy in light of the petroleum sector's declining performance and the uncertainties that are caused by the global shift to cleaner energy.
Thank you. Our topic of discussion today is strengthening Nigeria's methane reduction amid European Union regulatory pressure. When drilling for oil, natural gas can be released. Fossil fuel companies prefer to let the natural gas burn off because they cannot economically sell or capture it. Despite health risks, fossil fuel companies prefer to release natural gas, which is 90% methane, through flaring. Flaring releases carbon dioxide and other toxic pollutants, including methane emissions that can cause cancer. So let's set a bit of context. Nigeria's decade of gas ambition is gaining momentum. What is the connection between the gas ambition and the potential increase in methane emissions? Ms. Tengi.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very good place to start. The decade of gas ambition is essentially Nigeria's ambition to utilize its gas resources and its gas reserves. Nigeria has about 200 trillion cubic feet of gas, and it aims to utilize that resource to bridge its energy access needs, to increase government revenues, and to industrialize, to achieve economic growth. The decade of gas spans from 2021 to 2030. Through the NRGI's recent efforts, the government actually released its Decade of Gas initiative and the details within that was released in May 2024. That ambition expects to switch Nigeria's energy uses to gas. So one example is from compressed natural gas for transportation, moving on from fuels, switching from kerosene use and charcoal to LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, for cleaner cooking, and also increasing Nigeria's gas use on its power grid as well. So there are ambitions to ramp up Nigeria's use of gas to achieve Sustainable Development Goals for energy access by 2030, and other ambitions that I've said, there's also an ambition to also increase exports and get revenues from gas exports. The challenge here is that with these increases, there's potential to be increasing infrastructure, increasing petroleum assets, so more pipelines, more storage tanks, etc. And by using those appliances, there's a potential for gases to escape. In terms of gas flaring, either intentional or unintentional, in form of leaks, or in terms of operational oil and gas activities. And so NRGI is stating that the government needs to be very mindful that it manages the potential emissions that can escape from those activities by adopting technologies and investing in methane abatement technologies that will help use that potential increase in methane emissions.
Wow, that's incredible. Ms. Teng, you recently published a report on strengthening methane emissions reduction strategy in Nigeria. What is Nigeria's annual methane emission, and where does the bulk of it come from? How does this pose risk to Nigerian oil communities?
Another very good question. I'll start by explaining the components of methane emissions. So you have venting, which is an intentional increase or release rather of gas, which could be otherwise converted for commercial uses. You have fugitives, which are accidental emissions that you can have from storage tanks, pipelines, wells, and other equipment. Then you have gas flaring, which can escape as part of production. It happens a lot when you have oil production as well. So those are the three different types of components, rather, that make up methane emissions. From the IEA, the International Energy Agency estimates, were able to determine that in 2023, venting contributed to 67% of emissions in Nigeria, fugitives 19%, and gas flaring around 11%. Venting, obviously, as I said before, is an intentional release. So it's quite high, and with strengthened methane emissions practices, the government can limit that intentional release, essentially venting. However, even though gas flaring appears to be the least of the emissions, it's actually still significant because Nigeria forms part of the 10 countries around the world that contributes to 75% of gas flaring, according to the World Bank Global Gas Flaring Data of 2023. And that has presents a lot of health risks to oil-producing communities, such as cardiovascular defects, respiratory issues, and those oil communities, which are typically riverine, also suffer from sea encroachment and flooding. We've had that in the news over the last number of years. You'd have also heard about the effects of gas flaring illegal as well, from illegal activities and otherwise, of suits in Port Harcourt, of clothing turning black, a lot of these different things. So these are real issues that people suffer day to day, and the government implementing strong methane emissions reduction strategies would help to mitigate these effects on those who live in the communities.
Wow, thank you. Beyond the environment, there are also economic reasons for Nigeria to reduce methane emissions, with the European Union regulation on methane emissions kicking in 2027. How will this affect Nigeria?
This is a very good, place to speak about Nigeria's ambition to leverage gas for increased exports, to increase government revenues, to deliver on our energy transition goals or even our economic development goals. That potential ambition can be stalled if the government does not put in place strong methane emissions regulations, because the EU, the European Union, serves as one of Nigeria's biggest markets for its exports. It accounts for about 43% of Nigeria's crude oil exports and 60% of liquefied natural gas. The regulations that's coming into force in January 2027 will impose very strict monitoring, reporting, and verification standards that if countries do not meet those standards, they will be subject to penalties, fines, or exclusion completely from the European market. There will likely be other markets that adopt similar sort of regulations. So if Nigeria aims to increase exports and generate revenues from that to achieve its development goals, Nigeria would have to be very proactive and put in place regulations that do not exclude it from markets where it requires those sort of funding. Additionally, from a additionally, from an SDN report, Nigeria would have received $280 million from gas flares from 2020 alone. From the period of 2018 to 2020, fines of about 1.2 billion could have been received from flares. We don't know to what extent these flares have been, or these flare fines have been taken or gotten by the government, but clearly with a country that's suffering from all the debts issues and fiscal issues, Nigeria would benefit heavily from getting that sort of revenues. Also, from the IEA estimates in 2023, Nigeria could have earned $350 million from methane abatement by selling recovered gas. Nigeria does have a gas flare commercialization program, which, if that is ramped up, it would help to address some of these issues.
Can the natural gas as a transition fuel movement be also an important factor that reduces the amount of flaring and methane emissions in Nigeria?
Okay, Nigeria had that it would use gas as a transition fuel in achieving net zero emissions by 2060, and that has been incorporated in its energy transition plan, which was published in 2021. The decade of gas fits into Nigeria's plans to realize gas as a transition fuel, right? So one of the key components I've already mentioned is the Nigerian Gas Flare Commercialization Program, the NGFCP, which originally started in 2016, but due to some stalls, has only fully ramped up this year. In May 2024 as well, the government released the licenses or awarded licenses to the licensees. And so that means that process has started, but it's important for that to be ramped up, because if that is ramped up, the gas that is flared, likely intentionally, from venting, because companies are unable to realize the commercial value, will now have a place to go in terms of in power plants or non-power use of gas like LPG and CNG, as I earlier mentioned. So certainly the government being deliberate about leveraging gas as transition fuel now, and also implementing the Decade of Gas initiative, would be able to achieve limited flaring, which then keys into reducing methane emissions and enabling Nigeria to meet both its national and global commitments to reduce methane emissions. Two of the targets I will highlight here are, one, our aim to eliminate gas flaring by 2030 and reduce fugitives by 60% by 2031. Time is fast approaching, so it's so important that the Nigerian government ramps up its NGFCP program.
Yes, those are very ambitious timelines. What are the challenges in monitoring, reporting, and verifying flares, and how can these be addressed?
That's a key question. I think there's been a lot that's been going on by the government in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verifying methane emissions. One, we have a gas flare tracker, which was developed by the National Oil Spill Detection Response Agency. We also have a methane tracker that's been developed by NOSDRA in partnership with the Stakeholder Democracy Network, SDN. And you have the NUPRC, the Upstream Petroleum Resources Regulator, has developed guidelines and regulations that provide steps that companies can take in reporting their emissions. However, it is self-reporting sort of format, which has its inherent challenges, right? The upstream regulator did confirm to NRGI that they perform source-based verification as well. So at the source, at the wellheads, at the installations, to confirm the methane emissions that companies are releasing into the atmosphere. However, it's very important to have more cohesion and collaboration between the agencies that are trying to ensure that Nigeria limits methane emissions, because at the moment, the upstream regulator has not been utilizing the gas flare tracker. We don't know whether or not they will utilize the methane tracker. But whatever happens, it's important for the government agencies to align, and also align with the National Council on Climate Change, who are responsible for managing Nigeria's climate action in general, to agree on modalities to track, to monitor, to report, and to verify our emissions. Because this will enable stakeholders, both international and national, and civil society as well, to be able to see Nigeria's progress against its commitments.
Thank you, Ms. Tengi. Who are the concerned stakeholders that can ensure Nigeria reduces methane emissions, and what should they focus on to strengthen emission reduction?
There are key stakeholders, including you and I, but also the government, companies, general public, civil society, and international partners. I'll start from the federal government. The federal government, through the National Council on Climate Change and the Federal Ministry of Petroleum Resources and the Federal Ministry of Environment, Department of Climate Change, are all responsible for ensuring that we have a strong methane emission reduction framework across the oil and gas value chain, so from upstream, midstream, and downstream. It's important for those actors to incorporate strong monitoring, regulatory, and verification systems and processes that are trusted and can be used by the regulators to ensure compliance with methane emissions regulations and targets. The federal government, through the Federal Ministry of Petroleum Resources, also should set minimum emission targets for companies to prevent Nigeria from being locked out of the different trade partners or trade markets. I mentioned the EU, but others that may also adopt similar sorts of regulations. Then for the companies should invest in methane abatement technologies and adhere to the strictest environmental and technical standards. And as we have continued to see a run-on of divestments on oil and gas assets, it's also important that both Nigerian government and companies that are divesting ensure that the new asset owners have the financial, technical, and environmental sort of background and standards to be able to also reduce methane emissions. Then over to the civil society actors and the public, so you and I, are responsible to ensure that there's an understanding about methane emissions and the impact both environmentally and economically. And also it's important to us to hold the government and the companies to account for emission data disclosures and accuracy and progress towards meeting national targets as stated in the National Determined Contributions, the Energy Transition Plan, short-lived climate pollutants, long-term vision 2050, the Climate Change Act, Energy Transition Plan, and all of these different instruments. And finally, it's important for international partners also to channel funding for methane abatement projects, prioritize those with clean community benefits and potential for replication. They should also support technology transfer that can support methane abatement and provide technical and capacity building for stakeholders, governments, private sector, civil society, general public alike.
Thank you. Finally, given the accelerating energy transition, we know gas is not a destination fuel for Nigeria. How can Nigeria balance its gas ambition with its climate goals and the imperative of the energy transition?
This is very important because, but I think Nigeria also recognizes this by stating that gas is a transition fuel. So as Nigeria looks at the decade of gas plans, it should make sure that it's reducing its methane emissions, and it's putting Nigeria in the best position to be able to get the economic benefits while that opportunity is in play. However, after 2030, or looking beyond 2030, Nigeria should integrate renewable solutions as well, hybrid solutions for its energy access, which actually will potentially increase revenues that will come to it to resolve its energy access needs and concerns. Also, the Nigerian authorities should, as it develops and implements its gas expansion plans, that's the decade of gas plans, should be aware and sensitive and reflective to mitigate the increasing constraints around financial, infrastructure, human resource related limitations imposed by the energy transition, to ensure that that balance is achieved between meeting a domestic energy demands and achieving a sustainable energy future.
Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Tengi.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Juliet. I'm really pleased that Clean Technology Hub has decided to take this conversation on. I invite those who are listening to visit the NRGI website, resourcegovernance.org, to access the publication that we recently put out, titled Strengthening Methane Emissions Reduction in Nigeria's Oil and Gas Sector. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us today. Remember, your participations and feedback means the world to us. Please don't forget to subscribe, share, and stay connected for more inspiring conversations. Until next time, stay informed.